In the course of more than 2 decades, Paul Scholes has lived in a state that few could understand, where one man existed simultaneously in two worlds but truly belonged to neither. On the pitch, he was the center of every movement, the brain controlling the rhythm of the match. But off the pitch, he withdrew to the point of nearly vanishing with no explanations. No need to be seen, no desire to be recognized in the way other stars still craved. And that very separation was not an easy choice, but a burden that stretched across the years, when he had to step into the light every weekend in front of tens of thousands of people, yet never felt he belonged to that light. He did not celebrate like the others, did not raise his hand to call out his own name, did not stand in front of the media to talk about his emotions, because deep inside there was a part of him that always sought to retreat, always wanted to return to a quiet place where no one looked at him as a symbol, but simply as an ordinary human being. And when the world demanded that he become a role model, a representative face, he chose silence instead, endured the misunderstanding, endured being undervalued in moments when he should have been celebrated more, especially in the colors of the national team, where he was not allowed to play in his true position, not allowed to be himself, yet he never spoke out in protest. All he did was keep playing football, keep existing in two opposing roles, one that the world saw and one that he kept for himself. And that very silence became his will, a quiet persistence, not loud, but strong enough for him to go through every pressure without losing his true self. On that seemingly quiet journey, what Paul Scholes left behind carried the stature of a legend that history cannot overlook. In the colors of Manchester United, he took the field more than 700 times, scored more than 150 goals from the central midfield position, a rare number for a player who did not play up front. He was a key factor in the most successful era of the club under Sir Alex Ferguson, winning 11 Premier League titles, 2 UEFA Champions League titles in 1999 and 2008, 3 FA Cups, 2 League Cups along with many other domestic and international honours, helping create one of the greatest teams in the history of English football. It was not just the numbers. He was also recognized by those who understood football most deeply when Zinedine Zidane called him the perfect midfielder, and Xavi admitted he was the model he learned from. And even without massive media campaigns or flashy individual awards, his legacy still lives on in the way matches are controlled, in the way one pass can change the entire situation, in the way one man can reach the highest level without needing to say anything at all. Before continuing into the journey of a man who has lived his whole life in the light but chose to exist in the shadows, please hit like and leave a heart as a sign of understanding for the things he has never spoken about. And if you want to explore the story behind that silence, please subscribe to the channel to follow the next part, where everything began with a little boy whom no one ever thought would become a legend. Before becoming one of the greatest minds of modern football, Paul Scholes was just an ordinary boy who grew up in Salford, a simple working-class area in the north of England, where small houses, quiet streets, and the rhythm of working life created a world with no room for showiness or overly big dreams. And in that world, Scholes was not the center of anything. He was not the standout kid in class, not the name mentioned in adult conversations, and not the one who made crowds stop to look. He simply existed like thousands of other children, quietly, humbly, and almost blending into the background of everyday life, where no one thought that one day that boy would change the way the whole world looked at football. In his family, Scholes grew up in a typical working-class English environment, where everything revolved around stability rather than ambition, and where attention was not given naturally, but had to be earned through standing out, something that boy never seemed to do. He was not the noisy child, not the one who always raised his hand to speak in class, not the one who came first in any game, but always stood on the edge of everything, observing more than participating, listening more than showing off, as if from very early on he had learned to live without needing to take up other people's space. And that very silence, which seemed invisible, became the first mark that shaped the man he would later become. There were no clear signs that he would become a professional footballer. No prodigy stories, no moments that amazed adults, and no early recognition from the outside. He was not born into the spotlight, but in an environment where everything had to be built from zero. And perhaps that was why he never carried the feeling that he was more special than others. Instead, there was a deep sense of ordinariness, to the point that even his talent did not recognize itself in those early years. At school, Scholes was no different. He was not the child who got attention, nor the one who was isolated. He was simply a face passing through the crowd, leaving no clear mark, always standing at the back in group activities, always choosing the least visible position, as if his instinct was to avoid other people's eyes. And in that quietness no one could guess that inside that boy a silent persistence was forming, a kind of will that did not come from ambition, but from being familiar with not being seen. But football, from very early on, became the only place where that boy did not completely disappear. Although he did not stand out right away, Scholes still found in this game something the outside world could not give him, a feeling that he mattered, even if very small, even if very quiet. And in those afternoon games on simple dirt pitches, with no stands, no lights, no recognition, he began to learn to exist in a different way, not through words but through actions, not through attention but through precision in every touch of the ball, as if the ball was the only thing that truly listened to him. While many other children expressed their personality through noise, Scholes chose to disappear into the match, and right in that disappearing something special began to form. He did not try to become the best in the way others expected. He only tried not to make mistakes, not to interrupt the rhythm, not to break the balance, and that was exactly what made him different, without anyone realizing it at the time. There was something painful but very real in Scholes's childhood, the feeling of existing but not being seen, the feeling of standing in a crowd but no one calling his name, the feeling of doing everything right but no one noticing. And that very feeling followed him, like a long shadow. It did not disappear as he grew up, but only transformed into a different kind of silence, deeper, thicker, and harder to notice in his later career. And perhaps it was from those seemingly unremarkable years that a man was formed, not through recognition, but through the quiet acceptance that he did not need to be seen in order to continue existing. A man whom the world would later call a legend, but who himself always started from the position of someone standing on the edge, watching life pass by without ever demanding that it stop for him. Throughout Paul Scholes's growing up years, silence was not just a habit, but gradually became a survival instinct, an invisible shell surrounding him, helping him stand firm in a world that always demanded that people speak up, show themselves, prove they were worthy. But Scholes chose the opposite way. He did not talk much, did not seek to attract attention, did not join unnecessary conversations, and never put himself at the center of any group, as if the fewer people saw him, the safer he felt in his own existence. In the youth football environment, where many players began to learn to assert themselves through noise, through strong words, through actions that showed personality, Scholes went in a completely different direction. He quietly observed, quietly learned, and quietly perfected every smallest detail in his playing style, but never showed off, never tried to be the most outstanding one in the dressing room or on the training field. And because of that, many people at first did not really pay attention to him, because he did not carry the energy that the world usually assigned to those considered special talents. That reserved nature did not come from arrogance but from something deeper, a feeling that revealing himself could lead to misunderstanding, and that silence was the only way to keep everything from breaking, and over time it became an inseparable part of who he was, to the point that even when standing among teammates he could still feel he was at some distance, not geographically but emotionally, as if he was always observing the world more than participating in it. Even in moments that should have been joyful, Scholes did not show too much emotion. He was not the type of player who celebrated wildly after every goal, did not run toward the stands, did not shout in the crowd, but often just turned away, nodded lightly, or returned to his position as if the job was not yet finished, and that very restraint made him completely different from the rest of modern football, where emotions are often exaggerated and turned into part of the stage. In the Manchester United dressing room, he was also not the one who talked a lot, not the one who stood up to speak, not the one who led with words, but his presence carried a different kind of weight, a type of influence that did not come from volume but from stability, from the way he trained, from the way he maintained his own standards every day, and even without saying it, teammates understood that there are people who do not need words to create influence. They only need consistency in the way they exist. But that very silence also carried a dark side that few noticed, because when a person does not share, does not reveal, does not explain, the world around them begins to fill the gap with their own guesses, and Scholes lived in that state for a very long time, where he never felt the need to correct how others understood him, even when that misunderstanding sometimes made him seem more distant in the eyes of the public. But for him, being misunderstood was still gentler than having to say things he did not want to say. That silence gradually became a suit of armor, not to hide weakness, but to protect an inner world that had grown used to running on its own without outside interference. And over time, that armor became so natural that even he no longer noticed the boundary between his true self and the silent self he brought to the world every day. In football, where voice often comes with power, Scholes proved the opposite, that there are people who do not need to say much and can still control an entire match, and that silence is sometimes not absence, but a deeper form of existence, where everything is expressed not through words, but through every touch of the ball, every decision, every moment he chose not to break the balance of the match. And right in that long silence, a man gradually took shape, not someone seeking recognition, but someone who had learned to live without needing it. A man whom the world would later see as a legend, but who himself always started from the position of someone who chose to stand behind, where there was no light, but it was safe enough to continue existing in his own way. After going through those reserved years and living in silence, football became the only place where Paul Scholes felt he truly existed, not as a name forgotten in the crowd, not as a boy who always stood on the edge of the world, but as a man who could create influence with just one touch of the ball, where the ball did not judge, did not require him to speak, did not require him to become anyone other than himself. And in that world, he began to find something that life outside had never given him. That was the feeling of having value. When he joined the Manchester United Academy, Scholes was not a name that immediately caught attention. He did not carry the halo of a prodigy, had no early praise, and had no guarantee that he would become part of the first team in the future. Instead, he started like so many other young players, quietly, persistently, and almost invisible in a fiercely competitive environment where every day was a battle to prove he deserved to stay. In the first training sessions, Scholes did not stand out in the way people usually expected from a big talent. He was not the fastest, not the strongest, not the loudest, but he had something else, an almost absolute precision in every ball, an ability to understand the match in a way that few people his age could manage. And even though no one said it out loud, the coaches began to notice that something different was forming in the silence of that boy, a kind of football intelligence that did not need to be shown off to be recognized. But even in an environment seemingly dedicated to football, Scholes still carried the old feeling, the feeling of someone who did not want to be seen too much. He did not try to become the center in the dressing room, did not try to talk a lot to impress, did not build a personal image, and instead, he let football speak for him. Every pass, every movement, every moment of controlling the rhythm of the match was how he communicated with the world, a way of communicating without words, but with a weight greater than any statement. During his development journey at the academy, there were times when Scholes stood on a very thin line, where he could be left behind like so many other young players. But he could also step into the first team if he was persistent enough. And right at that point, he did not change himself to attract attention, did not try to become different in a forced way, but continued doing the only thing he knew, playing football accurately and quietly, as if every match was a test that needed no explanation. As he was gradually promoted to the Manchester United first team, Scholes stepped into a completely different world, where the pressure no longer came from being forgotten, but from having to maintain the standard of a big club, where every mistake was magnified and every moment was scrutinized. But even when standing under bright lights and the cheers of tens of thousands of people, he still kept his original nature. A person who did not seek attention, did not chase the spotlight, but only focused on the match, as if it was the only place that helped him keep his inner balance. The most special thing in this period was not that Scholes became a professional player, but that he began to realize football was not just a job, but a refuge, a place where he did not have to explain who he was, did not have to try to fit into the outside world. And in every match he gradually felt he was no longer the boy who once stood on the edge of life, but part of something bigger, where everything was defined by rhythm, not by words. It was in that integration that a special relationship between Scholes and the ball was formed, not the glamour of a star, but the quiet attachment of a man who found meaning in existence in the simplest thing. And every time he stepped onto the pitch he seemed to leave the outside world, where he once felt invisible, to enter the only space where his silence was no longer a weakness but became a strength, where he did not need to speak to be understood, and did not need to appear to be recognized. When he stepped out of the academy and was promoted to the Manchester United first team, Paul Scholes' life began to change in a way that even he could not immediately understand. It was not the noisy change of fame or lights, but a quiet yet irreversible shift, where a boy who once stood on the edge of the world suddenly became part of the strongest beating heart of English football. And although that moment looked to the outside world like a predetermined dream, for Scholes it felt like something that happened by accident, as if he had only coincidentally been placed at the right time, right place, and right system. In the generation known as the Class of '92, along with names that later became symbols of world football, Scholes was not the loudest, nor the one mentioned most in early discussions, but he was the one quietly shaping the way the match operated from inside, with rare precision and calmness. And while others expressed themselves through speed, strength, or explosion, Scholes chose to let football speak for him. Every pass, every movement, every moment of keeping the rhythm of the match carried the mark of a man who did not try to become the center, but could not be ignored. Success came to him faster than many expected. Big matches, important moments, and the first trophies in the red colors of Manchester United began to appear, along with recognition from the football world. But the strange thing was that instead of bringing absolute confidence, all of that did not erase the deep feeling inside Scholes that he did not really belong here, that he was only passing through a journey where he was not sure he had the right to stay long-term. As if success was only a temporary state, rather than something certain. Even when playing at the highest level, Scholes still carried a feeling that was very hard to name, the feeling that everything could disappear at any moment, that with just a few bad matches or a few wrong decisions, he could return to his original position where no one paid attention, where he had once been used to not being seen. And that very feeling did not make him arrogant, but on the contrary made him cautious, quiet, and almost never allowed himself to believe that he was good enough. In the Manchester United dressing room, among players full of personality, Scholes still kept his familiar silence, did not try to assert his role with words, did not compete for attention, and did not build a personal image. But that did not mean he was overshadowed, because, on the pitch, every time he touched the ball, the rhythm of the match changed. Every pass was a decision that shaped the situation. And even though he did not say it, people around him began to understand that there was a type of influence that did not need explanation to be recognized. But in Scholes's own inner self, that recognition did not fully transform into a feeling of belonging, because he did not go through the process of becoming a star in the way the world usually tells it. There was no clear step from unknown to famous, no explosive moment that absolutely defined him, but only a continuous series of progressions where he always felt he was being allowed to stay, rather than deserving to stay. And that very difference created a gap that stretched throughout his career. When the first trophies appeared, when the stage lights began to shine on him more often, when his name began to be mentioned in discussions about the new golden generation, Scholes still did not change the way he saw himself. He did not see himself as someone who had reached the peak, but as someone still in the process of proving he was not a mistake in the system. And that made his success carry a very different tone, not as liberation, but as an endless responsibility, with no stopping point. There were players who found confidence in trophies, in recognition, in the cheers of the crowd. But for Scholes, all of that seemed to only make clearer one thing, that he was living in a world he never dared to believe fully belonged to him. And that very feeling, though quiet, became the motivation for him to keep moving forward, not to prove to others, but to hold on to the position he always feared he could lose at any moment. As Paul Scholes' career gradually entered the mature stage in the colours of Manchester United, the football world began to realize that he was not just a good player, but a rare kind of intelligence on the pitch, a man with the ability to see the match in a way that others could only understand after everything had happened. And the most special thing was that he did not need to say it out loud to prove it, because everything he did was shown through the way he controlled the rhythm, the way he put the ball into spaces that others did not have time to notice. Scholes' passing ability was not simply technique, but a combination of timing, distance, and spatial awareness, where every pass of his was like a decision calculated before the match even began. And in moments when other players faced pressure, he appeared unusually calm, as if time on the pitch moved slower for him than for everyone else. And that very calmness made him an invisible center of the match, where every ball naturally tended to find its way to him. What made the greatest opponents respect Scholes was not glamour or showy plays, but pure efficiency in every action. And even the world's best players, like Zinedine Zidane or Xavi, once admitted that he was one of the most perfect midfielders they had ever faced or watched. Not because he always stood out, but because he was always at the right time, in the right position, and with the right choice, making the match always run the way he wanted, even without needing to control it with words or direct imposition. In the dressing room, Scholes was not someone who sought attention, did not join big debates, did not try to become a media symbol, and did not build a personal image like many other stars. He came to training, did his job, and left in silence. But that very consistency created a different kind of influence, where teammates understood that there were players who did not need to say much to be respected, because the way they played football was enough to define who they were. The media, which always looked for noisy stories and strong personalities, had difficulty shaping Scholes, because he did not provide them with the familiar materials of a football star. There were no controversial statements, no showy actions, no need to be the center of attention, and therefore his image in the eyes of the public sometimes did not reflect his true value on the pitch, where he was one of the most important people in keeping the entire system running smoothly. But that very silence was an important part of who Scholes was, because he did not seek external recognition as a measure of his own value. He did not need praise to continue playing, nor did he need the spotlight to feel he belonged there. Instead, he found confirmation in the match itself, in the feeling of the ball moving in the right direction, in the balance he created between the lines, and in the way the team operated as a unified whole when he was on the pitch. There was a profound paradox in Scholes' career. The greater he became, the less he was seen in the way legends are usually seen. because he did not build his image through outward emotions, but through inner efficiency in the match, and that made him a special kind of player, someone who did not need to be seen to be known, who did not need to be mentioned continuously, yet still had a deep influence on the way football was played at the highest level. In his peak years, when Manchester United dominated English and European football, Scholes still kept his calmness, did not let success change the way he appeared before the world, did not let trophies turn him into a different person. And even while standing among the biggest stars, he still kept an invisible distance from the light, as if he belonged to the match more than to fame. And it was in that combination of absolute talent and almost absolute silence that Scholes' image gradually became something that went beyond the ordinary definition of a football player. Not a person seeking attention, but a person who let football tell its own story. A person whose greatness did not need to be declared because it was fully expressed in every moment he touched the ball. When Paul Scholes' club career reached its peak with Manchester United, where he operated as a central part of a winning machine, in another environment, the white colours of the England national team opened up a completely different story. A story that did not bring a feeling of belonging, but on the contrary made him gradually lose himself in the very thing he once dreamed of, where he was no longer the person the club world had known, but became an adjusted, arranged version pulled away from his natural essence. In the colours of the national team, Scholes was not placed in the role he understood best, not as the central regulator, not as the one controlling the rhythm, but was often pushed into more unfamiliar positions, especially on the left flank, where it required him to adapt to a style of play that did not reflect his true ability. And that very change was not just a tactical issue, but a profound disruption in the sense of existence of a player who lived based on precision and naturalness in every decision. At club level, every movement of his carried clear meaning, every pass had a purpose, but with the England team, he seemed to constantly have to adapt to a system not made for him, where players like Steven Gerrard or Frank Lampard were prioritized in the central role, forcing Scholes to step back, not because of lack of ability, but because the tactical structure did not allow him to be himself, and that created a long gap where his talent could not be fully released. Every time he stepped onto the field in the national team colors, Scholes carried a different kind of silence, no longer the natural silence like at the club, but the silence of a man trying to exist in a role that did not fully belong to him. And although he still played with absolute professionalism and still made every effort in every match, deep inside, there was a feeling that became increasingly clear that he was being separated from the very football he understood best, as if he was watching the match from inside his own body, but could not control it the way he wanted. The difference between the two environments became increasingly clear when at the club he was the center of balance, while with the national team he became a piece that did not quite fit. And that mismatch not only affected his form, but also affected the sense of belonging, a feeling that was very fragile for a person like Scholes, who did not need fame to exist, but needed to be in the right role to feel he was truly playing football. In the major tournaments, pressure from the media and national expectations only added to the quiet discomfort inside him, because instead of being played in a system suited to himself, he had to adapt to constantly changing tactical demands, where the stability he was familiar with was broken. And that made every match no longer a free space, but became a test of endurance rather than the ability to express himself. No one could deny that Scholes still tried, still contributed, still played with the highest professional spirit. But the problem did not lie in the effort, but in the fact that he was never placed in a position that helped him become himself completely, and that created a prolonged feeling, quiet but profound, that he was living in a limited version of his own talent. Over time, that feeling did not disappear, but accumulated into an increasingly large distance between Scholes and the national team. Not a personal distance, but a football distance, where he no longer saw himself as part of the team's operating structure And every time he left the field in the national team colors, he carried the feeling that he had just completed a role that was not entirely true to his nature. The most painful thing was not that he did not succeed, because he still played at the highest level and still participated in major tournaments, but that he never had the feeling of being used in the right way, never being fully released in the international environment. And that very absence gradually blurred the connection between him and the England national team colours, not through a sudden decision, but through a long internal withdrawal process that stretched across the years. And in his familiar silence, Scholes did not react in the way people usually expected, did not create controversy, did not make strong statements, did not turn dissatisfaction into a public story. He simply continued to play, continued to exist in a role that did not fully belong to him, until the feeling of belonging gradually disappeared, leaving a gap where there should have been national pride, but instead became an incomplete chapter in the journey of one of the greatest midfielders in world football. As the quiet conflicts in the England national team colours accumulated through each tournament, each tactical change, and each moment not in his preferred position, Paul Scholes gradually came to a decision that was not loud, not dramatic, and carried no explosive statements, but was simply a withdrawal from a space he had never truly felt he belonged to. And at the age of 29, when many players were still at the peak of their international careers, he chose to end the England national team chapter in the quietest way possible, as if he had never wanted to turn it into a story for others to discuss. There was no long press conference, no detailed explanations about tactics or internal conflicts, no statements to protect his reputation or clarify his personal views. Scholes simply stepped away from the national team and left behind a gap that only time could explain, because for him speaking out seemed unnecessary and could even distort the nature of what he truly felt. A feeling of not belonging that had stretched so long it became reason enough to leave. In the modern football world, where every decision is analyzed, every choice is dissected, and every action comes with a media story, Scholes' silence became so special that it was almost hard to understand, because he did not try to protect his image in front of the public, did not try to explain why he could not show his full ability in the national team colors, and did not turn his departure into a dialogue with public opinion. He simply let everything pass as it had happened throughout his career, quietly and without showiness. That decision was not a sudden reaction, but the result of a long accumulated process, where the feeling of not being placed in the right position, not being used the right way, and not expressing his true self in the England national team's tactical system gradually became an undeniable inner truth. And instead of continuing to stay in an environment where he could not reach his best state, Scholes chose to leave, not because of failure, but because of the prolonged incompleteness he could not change. The most notable thing in this decision was the way he accepted it, without anger, without resistance, without turning it into a confrontation with the coach, the system, or the media, because Scholes was not the type of person who sought public conflict. He did not need to prove he was right, nor did he need to make others acknowledge that he had been used the wrong way. He simply accepted that there were places not meant for him, and the only way to preserve his inner integrity was to leave it. After withdrawing from the national team, the reaction from the football world was not uniform. Some understood, some regretted it, and some questioned why a player at his peak like Scholes could give up the national team colors so early. But his very silence made the answer more vague, because he provided no story for people to hold on to. No specific reason, no clear explanation, only one single truth. He had left. In the years that followed, as his club career continued to flourish with Manchester United, his absence from the England team remained a recurring topic. But for Scholes himself, that no longer carried as much meaning as the outside world still thought, because the decision to leave was not a statement against anything but a release from an incomplete state, where he could not live true to his football nature. There was no clear regret in the way he looked back at that period, nor any resentment, only a quiet acknowledgement that not every environment suited every talent, and not every career needed to be stretched to the end just because of others' expectations. And that very awareness made Scholes' decision, though controversial at the time, gradually become a reasonable part of his journey. Leaving the England national team at the age of 29 was not the end point of a failure, but the conclusion of a chapter that was never truly complete, where one of the most outstanding midfielders of his generation chose not to continue staying in a system that did not reflect who he truly was, and in that absolute silence, Scholes did not try to leave a big story. He simply stepped away, in the way he had always existed in football, without noise, without explanation, but impossible to forget. Throughout the peak years of his career, Paul Scholes did not just live one life, but lived two completely separate lives in parallel. One life that took place under the bright lights of the pitch, where he was the center of big matches in the colors of Manchester United, where every pass and every touch of the ball carried an almost absolute precision, and another life that took place off the pitch, where he almost vanished from the noisy world of fame, not seeking attention, not joining public conversations, and never carrying the image of a star outside the football space. On the pitch, Scholes was a completely different person, a man who controlled the match with rare calmness, where he did not need to shout to direct, did not need to show off to assert himself, but still made every rhythm of the match revolve around his position, as if he could see the entire structure of the match before it happened. And that quiet confidence made him one of the most respected midfielders in the world, not because of noise, but because of an almost absolute precision and stability in every moment of play. But when the match ended, when the whistle blew and the stadium lights gradually dimmed, that person almost disappeared, no longer the center of any story, no longer the one who was noticed or pursued, but returned to a completely opposite life, where he did not seek appearances in front of the public, did not like long interviews, and had even less need to build a personal image outside football, as if everything belonging to fame was left behind the dressing room door. That separation was not simply the difference between career and personal life, but like two entities that never touched each other. One entity existing in the world of tactics, pressure, and high-level matches, and another entity existing in stillness, where he was an ordinary man without any halo, without attention, and without any demands from the outside world. And this division stretched for many years without being broken. Even those closest to him could sense that difference, that Scholes did not carry his star version off the pitch. He did not live like a famous player when he returned home, did not turn his personal life into part of his public image, and did not let football completely overshadow his private life. Instead, he kept everything minimal, as if the fewer traces he left in the outside world, the better. What was special was that those two worlds never clearly intersected. There was no mixing between the light of the stadium and the silence of personal life, no symbolic transition between star and human, but only an invisible boundary that Scholes always maintained naturally, where he stepped onto the pitch like a tactical warrior and left the pitch like a man no longer connected to everything that had just happened. In the modern football environment, where many players build their personal brands alongside their playing careers, Scholes went in a completely different direction. He did not use his fame to expand his presence in the media, did not try to become a symbol beyond football, and did not attempt to define himself through public image, because for him, the only value that truly existed lay in the 90 minutes on the pitch, and everything else was unnecessary. That absolute separation made many people unable to fully understand who he was, because they only saw one version of Scholes, the version on the pitch where he was a genius controlling the match, but they did not see the rest. The part that did not appear on television was not mentioned in analyses and did not exist under the stage lights, where he was simply an ordinary man living a simple life behind the trophies. And over time, those two lives did not merge but continued to exist in parallel, without conflict, but also without intersecting, like two separate streams flowing through one single person. And that very separation created a special image in modern football. A player who could be great on the pitch, but completely disappear from the outside world. Not because he was forgotten, but because he never chose to become the center of it. When Paul Scholes' career entered a stable phase, and his fame in the colours of Manchester United had become an inseparable part of modern football history, behind the lights of the pitch another role began to take over the entire focus of his life. No longer the midfielder controlling the rhythm of the match, but a father carrying a quiet but prolonged worry. A fear that was not loud, not shown outwardly, but always present in every decision he made. When his son was diagnosed with autism, a truth that changed Scholes' private world in a way no one could see from the outside. From that moment, the priorities in his life began to shift clearly, but quietly, with no public statements, no symbolic changes, but only daily choices that were gradually adjusted. Where football was no longer the sole center of life and family began to take a more important position than any trophy or moment of glory. And for Scholes, that was not a dramatic sacrifice, but a natural acceptance that there were things bigger than the match. In the football world, where a career often demanded absolute focus and constant presence, Scholes still maintained peak form in the colours of Manchester United. But at the same time, he began to narrow the gap between the pitch and family life, spending more time with his children, prioritizing stability at home rather than long-away trips, and gradually building a rhythm of life where football no longer occupied his entire being as before. The worry about his son's future was not a sudden emotion, but a prolonged, quiet state of existence, always present in the silences between matches, between training sessions, and even in moments when he should have been enjoying victories, because for Scholes, victory on the pitch could not erase the questions in his personal life, where he had to face things that could not be solved with tactics or football skills. It was in this period that Scholes' image in the eyes of the public still did not change much. He remained a quiet player, not showy, not involved in media stories, but inside him a profound shift was taking place, where the role of father gradually became more important than any trophy, and where his football career, though still at its peak, was no longer the only thing defining his life. There were no big statements about family, no highly emotional interviews. Scholes kept everything in absolute privacy, but those around him could sense that he became more cautious, calmer, and tended to prioritize things with long-term sustainability rather than short moments of glory. As if every decision he made was influenced by something deeper than football. What was notable was that, despite carrying the great responsibility of a father, Scholes never lost his stability in his playing career. He still maintained high form in the colours of Manchester United, still remained an important part in the successful periods of the team. But the way he viewed football had changed. It was no longer the sole centre of life, but became part of a larger picture, where family and personal responsibility took an increasingly important position. In his familiar silence, Scholes did not turn the family story into part of his public image, did not use it to build empathy or attention, but kept it as a sacred part of his personal life, where he did not need to explain or prove anything, and that made his life completely separated between two worlds, the world of football and the world of family. And in that separation, a complete man gradually took shape, not just a legend on the pitch, but also a father carrying quiet worries, a man who always had to balance the pressure of his career and family responsibility. And though he never said it, one could sense that for Scholes the most important things in his life had never taken place under the stadium lights, but always lay in the quiet moments when he was with his family. When Paul Scholes' career gradually moved into the mature stage in the colours of Manchester United, what made him most different no longer lay only in his accurate passes or his ability to control the rhythm of the match, but in the way he deliberately withdrew himself from everything unrelated to football As if the more successful he became, the more he wanted to narrow his world down to just the pitch, family, and silence, where he felt safest. Scholes had never been someone drawn into the media spotlight, and while many players of his era built personal images, took part in promotions, appeared on media outlets, and expanded their brands off the pitch, he chose the opposite path, a path without showiness, without any need for attention outside football, and almost without any effort to turn himself into a public symbol in the way the modern world expected from a sports star. Throughout his peak career, he stayed away from unnecessary promotional activities, did not appear in side stories, did not get involved in media controversies, and certainly did not let himself be drawn into the whirlpools of scandal that often came with fame. Instead, he kept for himself an almost fixed rhythm of life, where football was the only thing expressed publicly, while the rest of his life was kept completely behind private doors. Even when his name became an important part of Manchester United's history, Scholes still did not change the way he approached the outside world. He did not seek presence outside football, did not try to expand his personal influence, and did not build a star image according to media standards, because for him his football career was enough to define who he was in the eyes of those who truly understood the game, and everything else was unnecessary. That choice made Scholes a special phenomenon in modern football, where most players were encouraged to become a brand, a public figure present everywhere. But he almost disappeared from that space, not because he was isolated, but because he actively did not participate, as if he always kept a clear boundary between the man on the pitch and the man off the pitch. And that boundary was never broken for many years, with no scandals, no controversial stories, no attention-seeking statements. Scholes' life off the pitch left almost no trace in the media world, and that very absence became something rare in the high-level football environment, where every action could become a headline. But for him, silence was always the more natural choice than any other form of expression. This did not mean he was completely separated from the world, but rather that he very carefully selected what he allowed into his personal life, keeping everything minimal, where family, football, and inner stability were the top priorities, while fame, media, and attention were merely external factors that did not need to be engaged with beyond what was necessary. In the Manchester United dressing room, Scholes was still an important part of the collective, but when he left it, he did not carry any star image outside. There was no transition between the role of player and the role of celebrity, as if those two worlds had never touched each other, and he deliberately kept them always separate, even in the most brilliant, successful periods, when he won major trophies with the club, when his name was mentioned in discussions about the greatest midfielders in the world. Scholes still did not change his way of living, did not expand his personal presence, did not participate in activities that commercialized his image, and did not try to turn himself into a symbol beyond football. His simplicity was not a constructed image, but a consistent choice that stretched throughout his career. A choice that came from his introverted nature and from the feeling that the world outside football was not a place he needed to belong to, and that was why he always kept distance from things that could pull him away from focus on the match and family. And in that choice, Scholes' life became special in a very unique way. Not the story of a man always seeking the spotlight, but the story of a man who always tried to keep that spotlight on the pitch where he truly belonged, while the rest of the world was kept at a safe distance, enough for him to live fully in both roles, a legend on the pitch and an ordinary man off it. When Paul Scholes' peak career seemed to have reached its end in 2011, after decades of dedication in the colours of Manchester United, his first retirement decision did not come with noise or drama. There was no grand farewell event, no emotional statements, but only a quiet withdrawal, just like the way he had lived throughout his entire career. And in that moment, many people believed he had left football completely, as if the door had closed after a long, glorious journey. But what no one saw at that time was the emptiness that began to appear in Scholes's own life, an emptiness that did not come from lack of fame or recognition, but from losing the only thing that had ever made him feel he truly existed, which was football. And when he no longer stepped onto the pitch every week, no longer had the familiar training sessions, no longer had a life rhythm revolving around the ball, he began to face a different kind of silence, deeper, heavier, and more uncomfortable than any pressure that had ever existed in his playing career. In the first months after retirement, Scholes did not find the liberation many had expected. Instead, there was a prolonged feeling of emptiness, where days without football became repetitive, lacking highlights and almost losing the meaning he had once been familiar with. Because for more than 2 decades his life had always been shaped by the rhythm of matches, and when that rhythm disappeared, he seemed no longer to know how to fill the remaining time. Unlike many other players who moved into media, coaching, or ambassador roles, Scholes did not immediately seek a clear new path. He kept his distance from the noise of the football world outside the pitch, but that very stillness made him realize that football was not just a job, but had become a structural part of who he was, a part that could not be separated, and leaving it was not simply ending a career, but like losing a part of his identity. It was during that period that something unexpected happened, when his body and mind began to react in a way he could not control, as if the football instinct still existed inside him, had never disappeared, and was only waiting for the chance to return, because although he had left the pitch, football had never truly left him. It still existed in the way he watched matches, in the way he analyzed space, and in the way he felt the rhythm of every situation. Not long after, the decision to return to playing was made, and Scholes put on the Manchester United colours again, stepping back onto the pitch once more as if he had never left. And what was astonishing was that he did not need time to adapt, did not need a long reintegration process, because everything that had once belonged to him in football seemed never to have disappeared, only temporarily hidden by the silence of life outside. Scholes's return did not carry the symbolic weight that media stories usually tell. There was no showiness or grand declarations, but simply a man returning to the place where he belonged, and immediately continuing to do what he had always done, controlling the match with calmness, passing the ball with precision, and maintaining the rhythm of the match with an almost instinctive football intelligence, as if no period of interruption had ever existed. But the most important thing did not lie in the form, but in the fact that leaving had not brought him the liberation many imagined. Because football was not something he could simply put down and walk away from, but a part that had sunk deep into the way he existed. And when it was missing, life became incomplete, not because of lack of fame, but because of the lack of the structure that had shaped his entire being for many years. In that return, Scholes did not change himself, did not try to prove anything to the world, did not seek additional recognition. He simply continued playing football the way he always had, as if the instinct inside him had never stopped. And that made his return one of the most special moments in the career of a player who had never lived according to ordinary patterns. And from that moment, one truth became clearer than ever, that for Paul Scholes, football was not just a profession that could begin and end, but an inseparable part of his very self, something that did not disappear when he left the pitch, and could not be replaced by anything else in life, because no matter how many times he stepped away from the pitch, football would always be the only place where he truly belonged. When Paul Scholes' career reached its final stage in the colours of Manchester United, there was no moment that was truly staged as a proper farewell. There was no big stage, no grand tribute ceremony, no long speeches or tears captured in front of the cameras, and no event that made the football world stop to say that a legend was leaving. Everything happened in such a quiet way that many people only realized it after everything had ended. In his final retirement, Scholes did not create any sign of a symbolic ending. He did not turn it into a media story, did not turn it into a farewell program, and did not seek attention from the public. Instead, he simply stepped off the pitch, the way he had always stepped off after every match, quietly, neatly, and without leaving noisy echoes, as if leaving was a natural part of the journey rather than an event that needed to be remembered. What made this story special was not the departure of a player, but the way he departed. Because in modern football, where every moment is recorded, analyzed, and turned into collective memory, Scholes' silence became something so rare that it was almost unusual. There were no long tributes, no farewell images repeated on the media, no feeling that a great chapter of history had just closed, and that made many fans only truly realize his absence when it was already too late. Even those who had followed Manchester United's career did not have the chance to prepare for this goodbye in the usual way, because Scholes did not leave a clear emotional space for the public to enter. He did not build an ending story, did not create a farewell ritual, and did not seek empathy from the outside, as if he had always believed that football itself was enough to tell its own story without needing any more words. And that very absence created a strange feeling in the hearts of the fans, a feeling of incompleteness, because they were not able to witness the moment when a symbol truly said goodbye, were not able to see the explosive emotional moments that usually accompany the end of a great career, but only the prolonged silence after he had left, a silence that forced them to piece together their own memories of him, instead of being guided through an official farewell. While many other legends chose to close their careers with emotional ceremonies, Scholes chose simplicity to the point of being almost cruel to his own history, because he did not leave a final highlight for the world to remember, had no final chapter told in words, but only a gradual disappearance from the pitch, as if he had never wanted to turn his football life into a story with a clear climax and ending. Even within Manchester United, Scholes' departure was not showy. There were no media-ized farewell rituals, no moment when the stadium stood up in unison to honor him, but only a natural transition where a player had completed his journey and quietly withdrew, leaving behind gaps that only those who truly understood his value could fully feel. But what was even more worth noting was Scholes' own feeling at that moment. Not regret or remorse, but a quiet acceptance that everything had reached its natural end, without needing to be extended further or explained further, because for him football had never been a stage to end with emotion, but a job carried out with precision and silence until the final second. And when he left the pitch, the football world only then began to realize that they had not truly said goodbye to him in the way they usually did with other legends. Because there was no moment big enough to mark the end, no image strong enough to become a farewell symbol, only a gradual absence, as if he had never needed the world to see him leave. That very silence made Paul Scholes' story different. Not a career that ended with prolonged applause, but an almost unannounced departure, where one of the greatest midfielders of his generation disappeared from the pitch in the way he had lived his entire life, quietly, without showiness, and without leaving a proper goodbye to the world that had witnessed his greatness. After stepping away from the pitch in the colours of Manchester United, Paul Scholes' life did not move into a new chapter full of lights or noisy roles like many other football legends. Instead, it was a gradual withdrawal, with almost no clear boundary between still existing in football and having left football, because he never sought continuous presence in front of the public and did not try to turn himself into a media figure after retirement. In the years that followed, Scholes still appeared in some football-related activities, but always at a very limited level. Not central, not seeking a leading role, and not placing himself in positions that required great media attention, as if he only wanted to maintain a light connection with the sport that had shaped his entire life rather than returning fully in a new public role. He did not become a regular television face, did not appear continuously in commentary programs, did not build a personal image as a football media expert, and did not participate in public debates about modern football, because for Scholes the connection with football after retirement did not need to be shown through constant presence, but could exist in silence and personal choice. Most of his time was devoted to family, where life took place far from stadium lights and media attention, a life that was stable, private, and almost without disruption, where the role of father and husband became more important than any title related to his career, and where he could exist without needing to meet expectations from the outside. In this period, Scholes's image in the eyes of the public began to change naturally, not because of a big event or an attention-grabbing statement, but simply because he no longer appeared regularly, no longer was part of the daily flow of football media. And that prolonged absence made his name gradually recede into the background of collective memory, even though his professional value and legacy in the colours of Manchester United remained unchanged. Unlike many other legends who continued to maintain a strong presence after retirement, Scholes did not try to keep himself at the center of football discussions, did not use his fame to expand his personal influence, and did not try to maintain a continuous public image. Instead, he chose silence and privacy, which made him gradually become a less visible figure in media stories, even though his historical value was still mentioned in specialized analyses. Over time, Scholes's fading public image did not mean a reduction in his influence in football, but it created an increasingly large gap between his actual legacy and the level of appearance in modern media life, where louder names that appeared more frequently easily captured public attention while he gradually withdrew into a space with less light. Nevertheless, in professional circles, his value remained intact, even increasingly recognized over time as players and coaches of later generations began to recall his match control, tactical thinking, and rare stability. But Scholes did not participate in reshaping his own image, did not take advantage of that recognition to return to the center of attention, but continued to keep his familiar distance from the public world. In his personal life, he maintained a simple rhythm, staying away from showiness, not getting drawn into image-related activities, and not seeking appearances at major football events unless truly necessary, as if he always chose to stand on the edge of the spotlight, even though that spotlight had once shone on him throughout many years of his peak career. And that very choice made Paul Scholes' image in the eyes of the public gradually fade over time, not because he was forgotten, but because he no longer appeared often enough to maintain continuous presence. And in that fading, he seemed to achieve what he had always aimed for from the beginning, a life not dominated by light, where he could exist in the quietest way, far from the noise of the football world he had once conquered. When looking back at Paul Scholes' entire journey in the colours of Manchester United, what remains is not only the trophies or statistical numbers, but a type of influence that goes beyond the framework of fame, a legacy formed not from noisy moments, but from stability, precision, and a rare football intelligence that has shaped the way many later generations of midfielders understand their role on the pitch. For many years, he became a special role model for players in the central area, not in a showy or easily recognizable symbolic way, but in a quiet yet profound way, where the ability to control the rhythm of the match, read situations, and make decisions at the right moment became the standard mentioned every time people talked about a complete midfielder. And that made Scholes' name always kept in discussions about the greatest players in football history. Not a few top players in the world from different generations had once admitted their special respect for him, because although he was not the one who appeared most on the media, he was the one that those who understood football deeply always rated very highly, like Zinedine Zidane or Xavi, who saw him as a standard of intelligence and playing style, where football was not only physicality or technique, but also thinking and the ability to see the match in a different way. Scholes' career was not built on noise or big media campaigns, but on sustainability stretched over many years, where he maintained high form for most of his peak playing time, always an important part in Manchester United's operating system, and contributed to the club's long successful periods, not by taking over the stage lights, but by ensuring that the entire structure on the pitch operated smoothly. What made his legacy special was not individual trophies, but the way he redefined the role of a central midfielder in modern football, where simplicity in choices, precision in passing, and the ability to control space became factors as important as goals or spectacular plays. And that subtlety influenced the way many coaches and players viewed his position in the team. Throughout his career, Scholes never tried to become a symbol beyond football. He did not deliberately build a personal image, did not seek fame as a parallel goal to his playing career, and did not turn himself into a media figure after retirement. But the paradox was that this very lack of seeking made him one of the most respected names in English football history, because his value did not come from appearance, but from efficiency and stability in every match. Even after stepping away from the pitch, Scholes' image continued to exist in the memory of those who understood football, not like a star always appearing in front of the public, but like a standard for how a midfielder could influence the match without needing to become the center of attention. And that made his legacy enduring, going beyond the era in which he played. In the end, Paul Scholes' story is not only the story of a great player, but the story of a man who never truly belonged to the world of glamour, even though he had conquered it. A man who always stood on the boundary between presence and disappearance. And it was in that quietness that he left a legacy that needed no explanation, only to be seen through the way modern football still continues to be influenced by what he once created on the pitch. Looking back at Paul Scholes' entire journey in the colours of Manchester United, viewers do not only see a football legend, but also a man who lived in a profound separation between light and shadow, between the brilliant pitch where he was honoured by legends like Zinedine Zidane and Xavi, and his personal life where he almost disappeared from the noisy world of fame. The saddest thing in the story does not lie in the trophies he won, but in the fact that he never truly belonged to the place he had conquered, always living with the feeling that he was only temporarily allowed to exist at the peak rather than enjoying it fully. When he left the England national team at the age of 29, with no grand farewell, no emotional media story, only silence, just like the way he had lived throughout his career, that made people realize that there were cracks that did not come from failure, but from a talent that was never placed in the right position to shine completely. Even when he retired for the first time in 2011 and then returned to play, Scholes still did not find the emptiness many thought, because football was not only a profession, but the only place where he felt he existed. A truth that was both great and sad. What made his legacy special was the contrast. A player with profound influence on the way modern football is played, but who lived a life almost without glamour off the pitch, choosing silence instead of fame, choosing family instead of public image, and choosing withdrawal instead of explanation. For American people, this story carries a clear lesson. Success is not only about standing at the peak, but also about whether a person feels they belong there or not. In a society that always pushes fame and showiness, Scholes reminds us that true value sometimes lies in silence, in discipline, and in daring to live true to one's own nature even when the whole world does not fully understand it. And that is why his legacy is not only about passes or trophies, but a sad yet profound reminder. Not every legend lives in the light. There are people who become great precisely because they never needed the light to exist. If the story of Paul Scholes has touched you with its silence, depth, and the things that were never spoken, please hit subscribe to join us in continuing to explore the legends who live in the shadows of glory. Thank you for accompanying us, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to tell the stories of great people who have never truly belonged to the stage lights.